You are experiencing a unique two-host AI conversation powered by Google's Notebook LM for deeper, more dynamic book analysis.
It's a real pleasure to be here.
Today, we are tackling a topic that feels, on the surface, like it should be simple. But the moment you peel back that first layer, you realize it's the foundation of, well, literally everything else.
Everything.
We are talking about education.
And it's so important to clarify right from the start, we're not just talking about schooling, not just the mechanics of getting a degree or how to land a job.
No.
We are looking at what Adler calls the perennial, practical problem of how to form a human being.
Exactly. It's the question of what makes us. And to guide us through this immense topic, we have a very specific piece of source material we're focusing on today.
We do.
We're diving into Mortimer Adler's essay on education, which comes from the Syntopicon. That's the incredible index and guide to the great books of the Western world.
And it's really important to emphasize what you just said. This is an essay. It's a synthesis. Adler isn't trying to invent a new philosophy of education from scratch here.
He's a guide.
He's acting as a cartographer, a map maker. He is meticulously charting how the greatest minds in Western history, we're talking from Plato all the way to Freud, have argued, debated, and built upon this one single idea.
That's a timeline that stretches from the agora in ancient Athens right into the modern psychologist's office. It's vast.
You should think of education as the grand central station where all these abstract philosophical ideas have to meet the real world.
Okay, I like that analogy.
It's the place where epistemology, the theory of knowledge, has to become pedagogy, the actual method of teaching.
So the what is truth becomes how do you teach it?
Precisely. It's where political theory stops being a thought experiment and turns into actual civic training. It's where theology becomes spiritual direction. Adler's point is that you can't really have a serious conversation about education without immediately needing to talk about the state, the soul, God, virtue, truth, all of it.
It's the delivery system. It's the mechanism by which we try to transfer all those other big ideas to the next generation. It is, in a very real sense, the delivery system for civilization.
That's a perfect way to put it. And Adler himself uses this beautiful phrase to describe the whole project. The great conversation.
The great conversation.
He sees the entire arc of Western thought as one long, continuous dialogue. It's a conversation where Plato is speaking directly to Copernicus, and Copernicus is then in dialogue with Kant. This essay on education is our map of that specific conversation, the one about human formation.
All right, so if we're going to use this map, we need to understand the legend first. We need to define our terms. Where does Adler begin? What's the most fundamental split, the first big distinction he makes in the idea of education?
This is the one. This is the distinction that underpins almost everything else we are going to explore today. It's the difference between liberal education and servile training.
Liberal and servile. Okay,
Yep.
Right away, those words carry a lot of modern baggage. When we hear liberal, we immediately think of politics.
We do.
And when we hear servile, we think of, well, servants, subservience. It sounds negative.
And we have to try, for this discussion, to strip away that modern political context completely. It's not about left or right.
So what's the original meaning here?
In this essay, liberal comes directly from the Latin liber, which means free. So liberal education is, quite simply, the education intended for a free person.
For a citizen.
Exactly. It treats the individual as an end in themselves. The entire goal is the cultivation of that person's own mind, their moral virtue, their aesthetic sensibility. It is learning for the sake of becoming a more complete, a more fully realized human being.
Okay, so liberal education is about the person. It's about being. What about servile training?
Servile training, then, is the opposite. It treats the person as a means to some external purpose.
A tool?
Essentially, yes. It's training for a specific economic role or a particular task. You are being trained to do something, not necessarily to be someone.
That is a very sharp, very harsh distinction. It really does sound like one is considered superior and the other, well, inferior.
And historically, that was exactly the implication. In the ancient world, it was very clear-cut. If you had to work for a living, you received servile training. If you were a citizen of means with leisure time, you received a liberal education. But this is where it gets so fascinating in our modern context.
How so?
Think about how we use a word like vocational today.
Vocational education, sure. It usually means trade school. Learning to be a welder, an electrician, a coder, a medical technician. It's job training.
It's job training, exactly. But Adler points out this linguistic shift that is just absolutely fascinating. The original meaning of vocation was not job. It meant a calling.
A calling. That sounds much grander.
It was a spiritual or a high-minded concept.
Hmm.
It referred to a universal human calling, to realize one's specific capacities, to fulfill one's potential.
So a couple thousand years ago, your vocation was your destiny as a human being, your purpose.
Yes. It was the call to become what you were uniquely meant to be. Now look at what we've done to that word. We have completely inverted its meaning.
We have.
Today, as you said, vocational education is used as a synonym for servile training, specialized job prep. Adler makes the provocative argument that true vocational education for your calling as a human should actually be liberal education.
Wow. That is a massive flip. We are so conditioned to ask students, what are you going to do with that degree?
Right.
And the implication is that if it doesn't lead directly to a specific trade or profession, it's somehow useless, a luxury. But what Adler is saying is that the use is that you become a fully formed human being.
And that is the central tension that we're going to see play out over and over again through this entire essay. Are we making tools or are we making people?
Before we start tracing that tension through history, Adler also breaks education down into 3 basic faculties or areas of development. What are those?
It's a classical tripartite division. First, you have physical education.
Gym class.
In a way, yes, but the ancients took it much more seriously. Bodily health and gymnastics were seen as essential for discipline, for creating a worthy vessel for the mind.
Okay, so the body. What's second?
Second, you have moral education. This is all about the formation of character and habit, making good people.
And third?
And third is intellectual education, the development of understanding, reason, and knowledge.
Body, character, mind.
Correct. And as we'll see, different thinkers, different eras, they place very different weights on each of those 3. So let's go back to the source. Let's start at the beginning with the inaugural systematic thinker, as Adler calls him.
Let's talk about Plato.
Plato.
You simply can't talk about education in the West without starting with the Republic. And you can't talk about the Republic without talking about the cave.
You really can't. Plato's vision of the Republic is the foundation for everything that follows. For Plato, education is not just data transfer. It's not about filling an empty vessel with a bunch of facts.
He has a much more dramatic view of it.
He describes it as a turning of the soul.
A turning of the soul. That is incredibly poetic, but what does it mean in practical terms? What is being turned from what to what?
Well, think about his famous allegory of the cave. You have these people who've been chained up their entire lives in a cave, facing a wall.
Staring at shadows.
Exactly. There's a fire behind them, and people are walking past the fire carrying puppets, and the light from the fire casts shadows of those puppets on the wall. For the prisoners, those shadows are reality. It's all they've ever known.
Right.
Education, for Plato, is the painful, blinding process of being unchained, forcibly turned around, and dragged out of the cave into the sunlight.
And the sunlight is the truth, the real world.
The world of the forms, the source of all truth and reality. So education is an awakening. It is the often unwanted realization that what you thought was real was just a flickering illusion.
It's not a comfortable process. He describes the sun as blinding at first.
It's deeply disorienting. And because of that, because it's so fundamental, Plato has a very strict prescribed curriculum to manage this ascent.
How does it work?
You start with gymnastic for the body and music for the soul. And when he says music, he means the arts in general, poetry, harmony, rhythm, to bring order to the inner self.
And then
you move to mathematics, geometry, arithmetic. These subjects sharpen the mind's ability to grasp abstract truths, to see things that aren't physical.
it's a bridge from the physical to the metaphysical.
Perfectly put. And finally, you reach the pinnacle, dialectic, philosophy, the direct contemplation of the good itself.
It sounds incredibly noble, this guided ascent from darkness to light. But there's a catch with Plato, isn't there? There always seems to be a catch.
There is always a catch with Plato. It's the political twist. This entire elaborate educational system isn't just for the individual's personal enlightenment or happiness.
It's for the state.
It is for the Republic. Plato was designing a system to identify and produce the guardians, the philosopher kings, the ruling class.
It's less about self-actualization and more about state-sponsored social engineering.
In a very real sense, yes. Adler pulls a quote directly from Plato. Education makes good men, and that good men act nobly and conquer their enemies in battle.
So there's a very clear utilitarian, even authoritarian streak there. You are educated to serve the state.
Absolutely. Which brings us naturally to his most brilliant student, Aristotle.
who almost always has a counter-argument or refinement of Plato's ideas. How does Aristotle rebut this vision?
Aristotle, as always, brings things back down to earth. He is far less concerned with recollecting eternal forms from a past life, which was Plato's theory of learning.
Right.
He's more concerned with actualizing potential. He looks at an acorn and sees an oak tree. He looks at a human being and asks, what is this creature capable of becoming? Let's design a system to help it achieve that.
He's more of a biologist in a way, more practical.
Yes, but he also introduces an absolutely crucial distinction when it comes to virtue. He splits it in two.
How so?
He says intellectual virtue can be taught. You can sit in a lecture, read a book, and learn mathematics or logic. But moral virtue, courage, temperance, justice, that cannot be taught in a classroom.
So how do you learn it then, if you can't be taught it?
Through habit, ethos. You become just by doing just acts. You become brave by repeatedly doing brave acts. It's about practice, repetition, and habituation until it becomes second nature.
It's muscle memory for your character.
What a great way to describe it, yes. But then Aristotle throws another curveball into the discussion of the ultimate purpose of all this education. He brings up the concept of leisure.
Leisure, which to us just means free time, relaxing, vacation.
Not to the Greeks. For them, leisure school, which is the root of our word school, wasn't about lying on the beach. It was the time a person spent on activities that were done purely for their own sake.
Things that weren't work.
Things that weren't done for money or survival. And Aristotle argues quite radically that education is for the use of leisure in the pursuit of excellence.
So work is what you do just so that you can afford to have leisure time. And in that leisure time, you pursue what's truly human.
Exactly. Work is necessary, but leisure is the goal. You work to survive, but you educate yourself to live well. He would argue that if you are only educated in order to work better, you are missing the entire point of being alive. You're stuck in the necessary and never reach the goal.
That is a distinction we have almost completely lost today. We feel a sense of guilt if we're learning something that isn't immediately useful for our careers.
And Aristotle would look at that and say, that is a servile mindset. You're educating yourself as a tool, not as a free person.
Okay, so moving forward in the timeline of the essay, the Roman Empire eventually falls, and we enter the Middle Ages. This is what Adler calls the medieval transformation.
The whole context for the conversation shifts dramatically.
Things get religious.
They do. Because now you have the introduction of the Judeo-Christian worldview. The ultimate goal of human life is no longer just civic virtue or happiness in this world. It is salvation. It's knowing and loving God.
Yeah. And the key figure Adler identifies to understand this shift is St. Augustine.
Augustine is absolutely fascinating because he personally lived through that transition. In his famous book, The Confessions, he talks a lot about his own education.
He was a master of rhetoric, right?
One of the best. He was trained in classical rhetoric, how to speak beautifully, how to persuade, how to win arguments. He was a superstar. But looking back on it, after his conversion to Christianity, he says that all that training served his perdition.
He thought his elite education was actually condemning him to hell. Why?
Because it lacked God. It was all about his own vanity, his own glory. It was a tool for pride. But here's the pivot, and this is a crucial moment for all of Western history, which he lays out in his work on Christian doctrine.
What does he do?
He doesn't say burn the pagan books. He doesn't banish the liberal arts. He doesn't advocate for ignorance.
He repurposes them.
He reorders them. He says grammar, logic, rhetoric, all these classical skills, they are tools. And like any tool, they can be used for good or for evil. He argues that a good Christian should master these tools in order to better understand and interpret the Holy Scriptures.
So secular knowledge is now permitted, but only if it serves a higher spiritual formation.
Correct. It becomes the handmaiden to theology. Its value is derived from its utility in service of the faith.
Then, centuries later, we get to Thomas Aquinas. And this part of the essay, for me, was a showstopper. Aquinas uses this analogy for teaching that completely changed how I picture what happens in a classroom.
This is one of the biggest aha moments in the entire text. It's a profound insight. Aquinas calls teaching a cooperative art.
A cooperative art.
And to explain what he means, he compares it to two other things, medicine and agriculture.
Medicine and agriculture. Okay, let's unpack this slowly. How is a teacher like a doctor?
Think about a doctor setting a broken bone. Does the doctor force the bone to heal? Does the doctor actively reach inside and knit the cells back together?
No, of course not. The body heals itself. The doctor just sets the bone in the right position, maybe puts on a cast to protect it, gives you medicine to prevent infection. They create the right conditions for healing to happen naturally.
Exactly. The doctor assists nature. They cooperate with the body's own innate healing processes. Now think about a farmer. Does the farmer stand in the field and pull the corn up out of the ground?
No. The seed already has the potential to grow within it. The farmer just provides the right conditions. Good soil, water, sunlight, they cooperate with nature.
So Aquinas applies this same logic to teaching. He says a teacher cannot force knowledge into a student's head any more than a doctor can force a bone to heal.
So all the learning happens inside the student?
Precisely. He argues that every student possesses an interior light of intellect, a natural capacity to understand. The learning is an active process that happens inside the student's mind. The teacher is merely a minister of nature.
A minister of nature.
You can present the material in a clear way. You can guide the discussion. You can remove obstacles to understanding, but you cannot do the learning for them.
That is incredibly empowering for the student, but it must also be a huge relief for the teacher. You're not a manufacturer stuffing a product with parts. You're a gardener tending a plant.
It implies that the student is the primary agent of their own education. Aquinas even distinguishes between two ways of learning: discovery, which is learning by yourself through experience, and instruction, which is learning from a teacher.
And he sees one as better.
Not really. He says that, fundamentally, instruction is just a teacher helping you discover things more efficiently than you could have on your own. It is all, in the end, a process of discovery powered by the student's own intellect.
That connects directly to all the modern talk about active learning. You can't just be a passive recipient of a lecture.
Aquinas knew that in the 13th century. If that interior light isn't switched on and actively working, no amount of talking from the front of the room will matter.
We've covered the ancients and the medievals. That is a huge amount of ground. We're about to hit the modern era, where everything gets much more complicated with the rise of the individual and the nation-state. But before we dive into that revolution, let's just take a brief moment here.
Indeed. It's a good place to pause and reflect.
Mindful Moments, our YouTube channel offering AI book analysis, summaries, and critiques inspiring reflection and rational thought.
It really is a great resource if you are enjoying this type of rational breakdown of big ideas and want to explore more topics with this kind of depth.
Absolutely. Now, let's jump back into the timeline. We are entering section 4 of the essay, Modernity. The world is changing fast. The church's authority is being questioned, modern science is rising, and we have new ideas about what a human being even is. Who is the first major figure Adler points to in this new landscape?
Michel de Montaigne, the great French Renaissance thinker. And Montaigne is the kind of guy who looks at the formal education system of his day and just says, this is ridiculous.
What was his main complaint? What was his beef with it?
He absolutely hated what he called pedantic education. He saw that people were just memorizing facts and classical quotations so they could show off at dinner parties.
All information, no wisdom.
That's it, exactly. He has this wonderful cutting line where he says, we fill students' heads with knowledge, but not a word of judgment and virtue.
So he was arguing for practical wisdom over mere book smarts.
He was arguing for the education of the whole person. He famously said he'd rather forge his soul than furnish it. He didn't care if you could quote Cicero in Latin if you didn't know how to live a good life, how to face death, how to be a good friend.
Yeah.
It's a deeply humanist perspective.
But then the pendulum swings. We go from Montaigne's focus on the individual's judgment to Jean-Jacques Rousseau. I feel like Rousseau is always the troublemaker in these great conversations.
Rousseau is a profoundly complex figure because he seems to argue two completely contradictory things at the same time. On the one hand, you have his famous work, Emile, which is all about education, and in it, he advocates for a natural development. Let the child grow wild and free, follow their own interests, learn from nature, uncorrupted by the evils of society.
That's the noble savage idea that he's famous for.
It is. But then you have to look at his political writings, like the Social Contract. And this is the paradox that Adler points out. Rousseau also advocates for the complete and total subordination of the individual to the state.
Wait, hold on. How do you possibly get from let the child run free and be natural to total subordination to the state? Those seem like polar opposites.
It all comes down to his concept of the general will. Rousseau believes that to have a functioning, uncorrupt society, you need citizens who identify themselves wholly and completely with the community.
They have to put the group first.
They have to essentially merge their own will with the will of the state. He wanted civic indoctrination. He says explicitly that education should cause citizens to identify themselves with this greater whole. He wants them to love the state more than they love themselves.
That sounds terrifyingly like the justification for propaganda and totalitarianism.
It's the philosophical blueprint for modern nationalism. Rousseau says you cannot be a natural man and a citizen at the same time. You have to choose one. And if you choose to live in the state, education becomes the primary tool to mold you into a perfect citizen.
So we have Montaigne championing individual judgment and Rousseau demanding the individual be molded for the state. And then into this debate walks in Adam Smith.
Right.
Now, I, like most people, think of Adam Smith as the capitalism guy, the wealth of nations, the invisible hand. What does he have to do with the philosophy of education?
This is one of the most surprising and, I think, compelling parts of the entire essay. We all know Smith was a huge proponent of the division of labor. You know, his famous example of the pin factory.
Right. One person straightens the wire, another cuts it, another sharpens the point, and productivity goes through the roof.
It explodes. It's the engine of modern prosperity. But Smith was a moral philosopher first and an economist second. He was honest, and he saw the dark side of his own theory.
What was the dark side?
He argued that forcing a person to do the same simple, repetitive operation over and over, day after day, for their entire life, makes that worker, and this is a direct quote, as stupid and ignorant as it is possible for a human creature to become.
Wow. Stupid and ignorant. He really did not mince words.
He called it intellectual torpor. He recognized that while the division of labor is fantastic for the economy, it has the potential to absolutely destroy the mind and spirit of the individual worker.
So what was his solution? Was he saying we should stop the division of labor?
No, he was a realist. He knew that wasn't going to happen. His solution was universal basic education, funded by the state. But, and this is the crucial part, it was not to make them better workers.
It wasn't more servile training for a new economy.
Precisely the opposite.
Yep.
He argued for a liberal education for the working class so that they could simply maintain their humanity. He said workers need to be educated so they can have rational conversation and form just judgments about public life.
That is absolutely fascinating. He's making a democratic argument for a liberal education for the working class, not to improve GDP, but as an antidote, as a way to preserve human dignity in the face of industrialization.
It's a profound moral argument. He's effectively saying, we are going to use you as a tool in the factory from 9 to 5, so we as a society owe it to you to educate you as a full human being outside of that.
Which then leads us to John Stuart Mill. He picks up this torch of universal education, but he has a major, major concern about who is doing the educating.
Mill is a classic liberal in the political sense of the word.
Yeah.
He completely agrees that education should be mandatory. He believes you can't really be a free citizen if you're illiterate and ignorant, but he is terrified of the state being the sole provider of that education.
Why? If the state is going to mandate it, shouldn't the state also provide it?
He fears uniformity. He fears the state using schools for indoctrination. He writes that state education inevitably becomes a mere contrivance for molding people to be exactly like one another.
Like Rousseau wanted.
Exactly. If the government runs all the schools, they will just churn out obedient little clones who think whatever the government of the day wants them to think. He saw it as a form of despotism.
So he sees it as a nightmare, where Rousseau saw it as the ideal goal.
Precisely. So Mill proposes a kind of hybrid solution. The state should require education, and even subsidize it for those who can't afford it. But families should be free to choose the schools.
True choice.
Essentially, yes. Private schools, religious schools, schools based on different pedagogical theories. He thought state-run schools should only exist as competing experiments to keep the private schools honest and to set a baseline standard of quality. But the state should never have a monopoly.
It is truly amazing how these arguments from the 18th and 19th centuries are the exact same debates we see in the headlines today. School vouchers, Common Core, fears of indoctrination from both the left and the right.
The names and the specific issues change, but the fundamental philosophical arguments, as Adler shows, they remain the same.
Okay, let's move into section 5 of the essay. Adler pulls back from the historical timeline for a moment to look at some of the great philosophical debates that rage throughout this whole conversation. The first one is maybe the oldest question there is. Can virtue be taught?
This is the classic Socrates versus Aristotle debate, in a nutshell. Socrates, as presented in Plato's dialogues, generally argues for the position that virtue is knowledge.
Meaning if I know what is right, I will automatically do what is right.
Essentially, yes. He thinks all vice, all wrongdoing is just a form of ignorance. No one wakes up in the morning and says, my goal today is to be evil. They do evil things because they are mistaken about what is truly good for them. They think stealing that money will make them happy. If they truly knew in their soul that happiness came from justice, they would be just.
That sounds incredibly optimistic. My own experience tells me I know plenty of things are bad for me, and I do them anyway.
And that is exactly the counter-argument which you find all over. St. Paul famously says it in the Bible. For the good that I would, I do not, but the evil which I would not, that I do.
The struggle of the will. I know the good, but I can't bring myself to do it.
Aristotle backs this up from a purely philosophical perspective. He says knowing isn't enough. You can know the complete theory of temperance and still be a drunkard. You need habituation. You need to train your desires and appetites through practice.
So the synthesis seems to be that you need both. You need the knowledge from education to know what the target is, but you need habit, or as a theologian would say, you need grace, to actually have the strength to hit it.
That's a great way of putting it. Education can provide the map, but it cannot force you to walk the path.
The second big debate Adler highlights involves a new player entering the field late in the game: psychology. Specifically, he mentions William James and, of course, Sigmund Freud.
And this is where the very ground beneath our feet begins to shift. For thousands of years, moral education was about moral training, shaping the character, disciplining the will, cultivating virtue. Freud comes along and says, actually, let's talk about the subconscious. Let's talk about repressed desires and childhood trauma.
How does that fundamentally change the goal of education?
It moves the goalposts from being ethical to being therapeutic. Freud isn't trying to make you virtuous in the Aristotelian sense. He is trying to make you psychologically healthy.
It's about strengthening the ego.
Exactly right. For Freud, the goal of education becomes strengthening the ego, the rational self, so that it can successfully manage the constant raging conflict between your animal instincts, the id, and the oppressive pressures of society, the superego.
So it becomes a medical problem, not a moral one.
It becomes a medical or clinical problem. We go from a language of sin and virtue to a language of neurosis and mental health.
And we are absolutely still living in the middle of that shift. You just have to look at how schools today talk about emotional regulation or social emotional learning rather than character or duty.
It's a direct inheritance from Freud.
So we've traced this incredible history. We've looked at the core debates. Now we arrive at the final section, section 6. Why does any of this matter now? Adler was writing this essay in the middle of the 20th century, but reading it today, in 2026, it feels more urgent than ever.
I think it does. Let's go right back to Adam Smith and his warning about intellectual torpor. We are currently facing a new, supercharged version of the division of labor: automation and artificial intelligence.
The robots are coming for the jobs, as the saying goes.
And not just the manual labor jobs anymore. The routine, servile, white-collar tasks. The data entry, the basic coding, the logistical sorting, even writing simple reports machines can now do that, or will soon be able to do that better, faster, and cheaper than we can.
So if our entire education system is built on servile training, just preparing people for specific jobs, what happens when those jobs disappear in a decade?
We make ourselves obsolete. Adler, I believe, would argue that a true liberal education is the only real safeguard against that kind of mass obsolescence. Because the characteristic excellences of free human beings, critical thinking, moral reasoning, creativity, complex problem solving, understanding historical context, those are the very things that AI struggles with.
So in a great historical irony, the most useless education philosophy, literature, history, art might suddenly become the most useful in an AI-dominated world.
Because it makes you more human. And being more human is the one thing a machine can't replicate. It's the only competitive advantage we have left. We need to double down on the things that make us distinctively human, not train people to be second-rate computers.
There's also the powerful point Adler makes about democratic equity. He has this incredible quote: "Any society which abolishes the distinction of social classes should conceive education as essentially liberal and for all men."
This is such a powerful and challenging point. In the past, in aristocratic societies, it was simple. The aristocrats were the ruling class, so they got the education on how to rule. That was liberal education.
And the peasants, the serfs, they were the working class.
So they got the education on how to work. That was servile training. But what happens in a democracy?
In a democracy, in theory, we are all the rulers. We all vote. We are all supposed to be free citizens.
So Adler's logic follows. We all deserve the education of a ruler. We all deserve a liberal education. If we claim to be a democratic society, but we only give a rich, liberal education to the kids in elite private schools, while giving narrow job training to the kids in public schools, we are betraying our own principles.
We're not abolishing the class system. We're just creating a new one, a hidden one. We're creating a class of leaders and a class of tools.
And that is profoundly dangerous for the health of a free republic.
Finally, Adler talks about the importance of lifelong learning. And he says something that I think validates exactly what we're trying to do in this conversation. He says the great books are the adult education program.
He argues so passionately that school's just the beginning. It's the training wheels. You can't possibly fully understand Plato or Shakespeare or Montaigne when you are 17 or 18 years old.
You haven't lived enough. You don't have the experience to really grapple with the ideas.
Exactly. The great conversation is meant to be a companion for your entire life. You come back to these works at 20, at 40, at 60, and they reveal new things to you because you are a different person.
It's a way to keep the mind alive, to consciously fight against that intellectual torpor that Adam Smith warned us about.
It is the gym for the soul. You don't go to the gym once when you're in high school and say, okay, that's it, I'm fit for life now. You have to keep working at it. The great books are the weights.
So as we wrap up this exploration of a truly monumental essay, we want to leave you with a final thought to consider.
It's really a question you have to ask yourself. Am I merely trained or am I truly educated?
Is my learning primarily about being a tool designed for a specific economic function, a cog in a machine, a row in a spreadsheet? Or is it about becoming an end in myself?
And it's an unresolved tension. It's not a simple choice. We all have to make a living, so we need some training. But we also have to live a life, and for that, we need an education. We are individuals with our own destinies, but we are also citizens with public duties.
Education must somehow serve both our private fulfillment and the public good, and balancing those two goals will always be a struggle. But as this great conversation shows, it is a struggle worth having.
Indeed, it is the struggle for our own humanity.
If you want to dive even deeper into this topic, please click the link on screen for more on this and other essay subjects.
Subscribe, share, purchase via link, and think rationally.
Thanks for joining us.
Until next time.
See the many genre-based book podcasts at Mindful Moments. Nourish your mind on the go.